morning. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us today for what should be a very interesting conversation with David Shimer to discuss his book, Rigged: America, Russia, and 100 Years of Covert Electoral Interference. There's a lot packed in the book, David. Our very own Joshua Huminski wrote, I think, a very interesting review of the book, which I recommend to all of our participants today. But David, you're on a topic which is obviously both currently highly topical and interesting and useful, but you're also looking at it from a longer term perspective, which I think is kind of unique. A lot of folks since 2016 have discovered the issue of electoral interference or come to the realization that this is a big issue in the United States. Regardless of how much we understood or paid attention to the historical nature of electoral interference, it's become a hot topic. But I think it provided us through the book a way to understand in a deeper context in history why we should or should not be surprised at what we've learned over the last several years. So what I'd like to do today is, in just a moment, I'll turn it over to you, David, to make some opening comments, talk about the book, what you learned, what you want us to take as the key takeaways from the book. We will be opening the discussion to participants using either the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or if you click the participants panel and raise your electronic hand, Dan Mahaffey will moderate a Q&A session after David finishes with his opening comments, and we can call on you that way. But let's start with you, David. Why don't you just give us a sense of what led you into writing the book, and a little bit about some of the interesting things you learned along the way, and what are the kind of the key takeaways that you'd like us to take from the book. And thanks again for being with us, David.
Sure, yeah, and thank you very much for having me. It's really great to be here. I would say that I wrote the book in large part because of what you're describing, which is my frustration and sort of bafflement at the lack of historical understanding or even the availability of a history in discussing this very important issue, which is the threat of covert interference in our elections. Because whereas for every other sort of major threat or major geopolitical challenge, there is an understanding of how we got here and what our vulnerabilities are and how these practices and forms of offense and defense have evolved over time. Whereas after 2016, I was alarmed, frankly, that folks would discuss 2016 as if it were unprecedented or if it had, was new. And that's dangerous because that suggests that there's no history to it at all. And therefore, that there's no way to learn about how states interfere in elections and how to prepare for such attacks because it's never happened before, and that's simply not true. So what I do in my book, which I can talk about in brief, but I won't go on and on, is I restore history to the subject of covert electoral interference. I show how states have been interfering in elections for more or less a century, and how there are patterns and lessons in that history that we can and should be using to defend our democracies now. And in general, I would say that what I discovered in my research, I interviewed more than 130 people, 8 former CIA directors, a former KGB general. I went to many different countries examining archives and sort of trying to get at what is the history here to create for the first time a history of covert electoral interference. And what I found is that history can be divided into 3 parts, which are, I think, important to understand. The first is that between 1919 and 1947 was the first phase of this history. That was when the Soviet Union, under first Vladimir Lenin and then Joseph Stalin, were interfering in elections all over the world. First with an organization known as the Communist International, which was an international communist organization that the whole idea of which was to get communists into power in order to topple their governments and abolish national borders. And in order to do that, you had to get money to the communists and you had to help them spread propaganda. Those operations were rather ineffective, but they kind of gave birth to the core idea of covert electoral interference, which is very important, which is in every operation to interfere in an election, you're either influencing voters, which means seeking to mold public opinion, or you're seeking to alter actual ballots, which means you're literally changing votes. And what you saw at the end of the first phase of this history was the emergence of that second type, because Joseph Stalin and his collaborators interfered in elections across Eastern Europe, in Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, with extraordinary electoral operations. They spread massive amounts of propaganda to influence voters, millions of leaflets, pamphlets, and posters, but they also stuffed ballot boxes and manipulated voter rolls, which is, again, that second type of interference, which is altering actual ballots. The second phase of this history emerges after 1947, when Harry Truman decides to respond in kind to Soviet operations by authorizing the CIA to engage formally in covert action with the express purpose of interfering in Italy's election. The starting point of CIA covert action was electoral interference. In 1948, the CIA launched a massive campaign to manipulate the minds of Italian voters with disinformation, with black propaganda, by orchestrating popular initiatives, by scaring voters, all to get people to vote for the centrist candidates rather than the communists. The centrists won, so the CIA presumed, it couldn't prove, but it presumed that its operation made the difference. And then the Italian operation became a template for CIA operations all over the world. So now we're in the second phase of this history between 1948 and 1991, where you see the CIA and the KGB going toe-to-toe in elections all over the world, spending hundreds of millions of dollars adjusted for inflation in order to manipulate people, in order to fund political parties, and in rare instances to alter actual ballots. And in that history, by the way, this is important, the KGB was interfering in American elections. So it's not as though we were immune from this either. These operations were primitive, but they involve very similar ideas: finding and releasing damaging information about powerful people, spreading propaganda across vulnerable and penetrable information platforms, seeking to sow discord, especially along racial and religious lines. That was sort of the name of the game for the KGB. I was struck reading through the KGB's archives how much the diversity of the United States was a focus of the agency, how they saw our diversity as a vulnerability because it was so easy to exploit. And I spent about 4 hours with a former KGB general who said effectively the same thing, which is America is just a hotbed of hate and racism, and all we wanted was to advertise that to the world. So we would stage hate crimes. We would plant, hateful letters or incidents in order to show the world that America is flawed and enviable and really just fraudulent in how it seeks to present itself to the international community. Those operations, however, were rather ineffective. I mean, one more point that I do think is I wish more present in modern discourse is, who were the KGB targeting during the Cold War? They were targeting Republicans. They were going after Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon, trying to destroy their campaigns. So today, when folks like to say that this is a partisan issue or that it only benefits one side or another, that's simply not true. The Soviet Union and now Russia have helped the candidates who they believe align with their interests. In 1980, it was to destroy Ronald Reagan. In 2016, it was to help the Republican nominee, but that's not the point. The point is to hurt America or hurt American democracy, and to me, that is hurting the functioning of the American state. But to keep moving forward here, the third phase of this history emerges at the end of the Cold War. That's when the CIA moves away from, but does not ban at all, the practice of covert electoral interference. I interviewed for my book Bill Clinton and a bunch of his advisors, and was able to reveal that in 2000, the CIA did interfere in the Serbian election. Millions of dollars funneled to the opposition of Slobodan Milosevic, a very similar operation in many ways to the Italian campaign to try to get Milosevic out of power. But by and large, that sort of thing becomes the exception rather than the rule. Whereas you see in the post-Cold War period, Vladimir Putin's Russia rediscover and double down on this very old idea, an idea that stretches back to Lenin and Stalin. But the key difference is twofold. One, Putin has the internet now, which means that he can reach more people in more places with less money and in a more targeted way. And credit to him for figuring out that he could do that he can mold these old ideas with this new digital domain. The second difference is that Putin has abandoned the ideological constraints of his predecessors, which also empowers him. Because as I've talked about, whereas Lenin and his successors tried to help leftist candidates, communist candidates, Putin has said, I'm in a power struggle. I'm not in an ideological struggle with the West. I'll support someone on the far right. I'll support someone on the far left. I'll just sow discord as an end in itself. I don't care. The point here is to corrupt and tear down democratic systems. And that does two things. It gives him more flexibility in who he supports, but it also makes it harder for Western observers to get their heads around what he's up to. Because whereas, let's say, the KGB supported communists, so Americans and other observers could say, wait, if a communist winning, that helps the Soviets. Whereas today, I think it's very difficult for the public to keep track of what's in Russia's interest and what isn't, because it's far more complex today, where you could have Putin supporting, again, someone in the alt-right, but also someone on the far left, and both candidates would really help him advance his foreign policy objectives. So it's a bit more clever. And so you've now seen Putin launch a global strategy of covert electoral interference to interfere in elections as far and wide as France and Montenegro, to Colombia and the United Kingdom, again, to support authoritarian-minded, divisive candidates who will divide their democracies from within and one another, who will corrupt their democratic systems, who will opt for exclusive rather than inclusive policies, who will veer more toward nationalism than internationalism, and who over time will drift into Russia's orbit and away from America's. And of course, by targeting America itself, Putin aims to divide our electorate and to undermine our ability to be a cohesive society that can lead abroad, let alone function at home. So these electoral operations have been waged. Ukraine was a real testing ground, but applied to countries all over the world. I interviewed the president of Montenegro, who Russian intelligence tried to assassinate. I spoke with the former president of Colombia, who said that his information environment is under siege. So this is a global phenomenon that was then applied to America. So 2016 was not out of nowhere in any respect, whether historically or globally. It was just making America part of a story that was already unfolding. And I would argue that there were 4 core similarities to what Russia did in 2016 that were not new at all. The first is that Russia sought to sow discord and help one candidate. That's the oldest tradition of KGB and Russian interference. That's the whole point of these operations, to sow discord and to get someone elected. That's been happening for decades. It will continue to happen. There was nothing original about that. The second was that Russian military intelligence systemically targeted our voting systems, got inside our election infrastructure. And again, that's not new. The accessibility of it increased because of our digital connectivity. But as I talked about, Stalin and his collaborators altered ballots and voter data across Eastern Europe. Russian intelligence has sabotaged election systems in countries like Ukraine more recently. It's just been applied to America, but the idea is long in existence. The third similarity is the DNC and Podesta email releases, because what those was the acquisition of private materials and the release of those materials to destroy public figures. And that's a long-running tradition of Russian intelligence. For example, in the 1976 presidential election, the Soviets really didn't like a candidate named Henry Scoop Jackson. So what they tried to do was to find evidence that he was secretly gay, to then put that evidence into some sort of file and release it to newspapers. They hunted everywhere they could for this evidence. It's rather obsessive in their archives. They talk about all these different ways they tried to find private information that could damage Jackson. They came up short, so they made a fake document. They sent it to a bunch of newspapers and political campaigns. Those places tried to decided not to publicize it, so the operation failed. So what were the DNC and Podesta releases? That was Russia saying, we're still going to look for private information about public figures, but wait, now we can steal accurate documents instead of making up fake ones. And by the way, we could steal 50,000 accurate ones instead of make up one fake one. And we can upload that information directly onto the internet rather than rely on reporters to do it for us. So it was an immense turbocharging of a pre-existing idea, but that totalitarian notion of nothing is private, everything is the business of the state is long running. And the last similarity is what Russia did across social media. Because what Russia did with the Internet Research Agency, which was their troll farm, was seek to, again, sow discord and help a candidate, hide their hand, which is the nature of covert action, while also seeking to sow discord, especially along racial and religious lines, to suppress some voters, to turn out other voters, to scare voters in order to do what Russia wanted. in order to amass audiences and reach as many people as possible. All of these things the KGB did, and many of those things the CIA did in seeking to interfere in elections. The only difference was it was on Facebook instead of through newspapers, TV stations, and radio channels. So there is ingenuity here, but that does not mean that there's inventions here. There's a difference between evolution and creation that, in my opinion, is essential to understanding what's happening. And so to give Putin the credit that he is due, I would say that there were two things that he did that were achievements. The first was that he fused two types of covert electoral interference. He, at the same time, targeted our voting systems, was inside our election infrastructure, while also waging a massive influence campaign across social media and with stolen emails. And what I found in my interviews with 26 of President Obama's former advisors, folks like John Brennan and Jim Clapper and Susan Rice, was that fusion made responding to Russia's operation immeasurably more difficult. Because while the influence campaign was raging, there was also immense concern that Russia intended to escalate its operation toward altering the actual voter data and ballots of American voters and causing chaos on Election Day itself. And that became the preoccupation of the administration. There became a notion that what Russia was doing with emails and on social media was bad, but it could be a whole lot worse because they have this access to our infrastructure. So it's better to tolerate what the Russians are doing through Election Day and then impose costs on them thereafter, which was, whether that was intentional or not of the Russians, I imagine moving forward, they'll learn how effective it was to do those two plays at the same time. The second achievement, which is an achievement, is that Russia penetrated America at scale. Because during the Cold War, countries like Italy and Chile, their elections could be manipulated in really meaningful ways, whereas the KGB's operations in our elections were limited, as I already discussed. And that's part of why I think this feels so new to the public and to reporters, because there is a history of the KGB targeting American elections. There is not a history of Soviet or Russian intelligence meaningfully disrupting and directing American elections until 2016. So that was a new moment in terms of its scope and scale. And moving forward, I think that will become the new norm as Putin, again, turbocharges all of these ideas that have long existed. So what does that mean for us moving forward? I think the first thing it means is that we need to recognize that to defend an election is to defend against both efforts to alter ballots, which means we need to secure our election infrastructure, but it also means defending against efforts to manipulate voters, which means responding to tactics like what Russia did across social media and stolen emails, and also preparing for their future iterations. Because I think another lesson we need to keep in mind is that history did not stop in 2016. This is an ongoing story. These tactics are always evolving. Russia will not just do what Russia did 4 years ago and then apply that same playbook to the 2020 and 24 and 28 elections. That's not the way intelligence services work. They will come up with new ways to undermine and direct our process of succession. In that regard, I think another lesson here is that the best way to anticipate what Russia will do next is to look and collaborate with our neighbors, because this is a global story. What Russia did in Ukraine in 2014 is what Russia then did to America in 2016, and then is in part what Russia did to France in 2017, and so on and so forth. So instead of pretending as though this is just about us and we're all special, we're not. And what Russia is doing in other countries will be what Russia will then do to our country. So let's collaborate with our allies rather than cast them aside or leave each other in the dark, and try to work together in defending our process of succession and really our sovereignty. I also would emphasize that sort of the first step in doing any of this is recognizing that this threat is not political. And that's what I think history can really clarify. Because when you see that Soviet intelligence has been targeting American politicians for decades, that Russian intelligence is targeting politicians all over the world, this becomes a lot less about Donald Trump, and it becomes a lot more about the security and the sovereignty of our democracy. I mean, something that I was very interested to discover in my research is that Russia's operation to interfere in the 2016 election started well before Donald Trump announced his campaign and had intended to continue were Donald Trump to have lost. So this is not just about our current president. This is, again, about the functioning of our democracy and Russian efforts to degrade, disrupt, and discredit our democracy. And therefore, it really is not a partisan issue. And in my opinion, anyone who says so is really just creating impediments that shouldn't exist toward defending the security of our state. The last thing I'll say is that history, I do believe, provides reassurance, because I think there's a lot of, well, what can we do about this? We're screwed. This will never be a threat that can be resolved out there right now. And on the one hand, that's true. I think something that history clarifies is that elections are by nature penetrable. Lenin and Stalin both saw what Putin sees, which is that the whole idea of having an election is it's an open process that could be manipulated. Fine. I don't think it's true that there's any silver bullet that can totally secure our elections. But on the other end, I would say that we've seen in countries like Italy and Chile and otherwise, whose elections have been under siege, that doesn't necessarily mean that your democracy is therefore doomed. Japan's elections were manipulated for decades during the Cold War. Japan is still a well-functioning democracy today. This isn't a poison pill. It's only a poison pill if our citizens don't care, and if our democracy doesn't care enough to seek to respond to the threats that we're currently facing, and to recognize that in large part what it means to defend an election is to have citizens being more mindful of the propaganda they're absorbing, of being outraged by foreign interference regardless of who benefits, and of buying into national efforts to defend against this threat to our national sovereignty, which is what this is.
David, thank you for that incredible description of some of the key findings in the book. I think your research here will be very helpful in our understanding of both the significance of what we've observed here in the historical context, and also what we should do about it. I'm hoping to just start. I mean, I know we have a couple questions already queued up, and I want to invite others to submit questions via the Q&A or raise your hand, your electronic hand, to ask David a question. But maybe I can start with something that's kind of weighing on me. I feel kind of like, David, that we almost need a new lexicon to describe the terms that you laid out very clearly. You discussed in terms of what electoral interference is. You talked about how there could be an effort to influence voters or the electorate, or an effort to actually disrupt the balloting process, or change physical ballot outcomes. And you also kind of laid out the difference between efforts to influence the outcome of an election, to try to change or influence who wins, versus you described it as degrading the integrity of the institutions and of the democracy itself. I feel like in some ways that's kind of a strategic undermining of the democracy, an effort to, it happens during, maybe it happens more acutely during an electoral time frame, which of course in the United States is a really long period of time. So we call it electoral interference. But I'm wondering if you could just comment a little bit on terms and how you would advise people think about this. I feel like some of the challenge we run into is when we say the term electoral interference, people get a guard up, they get a shield up, because they think, well, you're talking about the legitimate election of my candidate. Now I'm not going to enter that discussion with you because I have to reject where this might go, and you close conversation in a way that's unhelpful. So what are your suggestions in terms of how we describe these things in a way that helps us, to a fruitful discussion?
Sure. So I think I vary, and I totally agree. I think that words like meddling that have been thrown around mean nothing, and should be not used in discourse by reporters or otherwise. I mean, the way that I decided to define what I study is to break it down. So I talk about covert electoral interference. What does that actually mean? It means three things. It means you're covert, electoral, and interference. To be covert, it means that the hand of the interfering actor is hidden. It means that a public endorsement of another candidate doesn't count, but if you release emails through a third party to hide your hand, it does. And so if you're not engaging in covert action, you're not engaging in the type of exercise that I view as a distinct threat to the functioning of democratic systems. to be an electoral operation, it means that you're targeting a vote that determines another country's leader. You're seeking to disrupt and direct a democratic vote of succession. And to be interference, you can't just watch, you can't just spy, you can't just collect intelligence. You need to act, you need to deploy active measures in order to interfere and manipulate a foreign electoral process, which is why I define covert electoral interference as a concealed foreign effort to manipulate a democratic vote of succession. And I think that, yes, there's a distinction in some ways between rigging a vote versus manipulating voters to cast their ballots in one way. But to me, that's the same story. It's the story of covertly interfering in electoral processes. And yes, can there be efforts to degrade a democracy outside of an election? For sure. But something that history reveals is that countries like the Soviet Union and now Russia view elections as an extraordinary opportunity to discredit and corrupt democracies, because what is an election? An election provides for the future. It provides for progress. It provides for order. It provides every citizen with sort of, this is how our democracy can proceed. And if you therefore sabotage that process, whether by sowing discord around it or by trying to help one candidate over another, you can make extraordinary progress not only in determining the future of a democracy, which is a huge appeal because you could determine who sits in the chair of let's say, the Oval Office, but you can also make citizens believe that their country doesn't work, that their democracy doesn't work, and then you can advertise to your own people in Moscow and otherwise, but also to the world, that the democratic model is flawed, unenviable, and a ruse. So if there were an influence campaign around a policy in the Congress, that would be a problem. If there's an influence campaign to make citizens believe that their election is rigged and that they don't actually have a process of succession, that's an existential threat to the functioning of a democratic system. So I do view electoral operations as a very distinct bucket. And I think there's a reason that covert electoral interference is a phenomenon over the past century, which is that both American and Russian intelligence have seen that these operations have the extraordinary potential of changing the future of other countries. And from the perspective of Moscow, of tearing down democracies in a really efficient and methodical way, which is to strike at the heart of any democracy, which is its electoral processes.
Thanks, David. I'm going to ask Dan Mahaffey now to field some of the questions that we've already started to receive from our participants. Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Glenn, and thank you, David. First question I have is one that comes from your the overview of your study and what you looked at. What were some of the best defenses you've seen mounted against electoral interference or covert actions, and what lessons can we learn from that?
So the story that I've remained struck by is the story of France's 2017 election, which is when Russian intelligence or Russian-linked hackers stole and released emails linked to the campaign or the emails of Emmanuel Macron's campaign. And this was just a few months after the America's 2016 election, when the whole world had watched us, go mad over the stolen emails in our own electoral process. And the French media, the French political class, as well as the French people, more or less said, we don't want to be played too. And these emails had very limited reach. These emails were not covered in any way comparable to what happened in America, in some part because of the tradition of the French press, but in other part because the French people decided that they didn't want to be gullible and manipulated by a foreign power. And I think that for operations to influence voters, a huge lesson across time is that so much of this is reliant on the willingness of citizens to be passive actors, not to actively say, what is the accuracy of the information in front of us? Where did this information come from? And why does someone want me to see it right now? But rather to say, oh, that's a gossipy email. I'm just going to take that in and I'm not going to ask any questions. And I think that our media environment is so much more geared toward the latter type of reaction, to just take in the propaganda without asking sort of any hard questions about why or what or from where. And across history, I think at a bare minimum, it's being more mindful about who's seeking to manipulate you. And I think there are other ways to secure your elections, both with regards to securing your infrastructure, with repairing some of the pre-existing fissures that make us so vulnerable, with having journalists and social media companies take more responsibility, and also with working with our Democratic allies to both deter and detect these sorts of operations. But I think at a bare minimum, especially between now and November, when there is no really national coordinated policy response to this threat, the first and most basic thing we could do is just have some sort of desire not to be played as citizens.
In your book, you one of the questions we have is the questioner is struck by previous generations of American leaders and how they declined Russian influence in their favor, and questions: do we sense that that norm is broken? Is it restorable in a longer term? You talk of the French lesson. Could that be a foundation to build upon, or are the norms in these electorates rather, can they ratchet downwards?
So I think we need to restore the norm that we should hold our elected leaders to a standard such that they should not be soliciting or accepting help from foreign governments. I think during the Cold War, as I lay out in my book, Adlai Stevenson and Hubert Humphrey, who were leading Democratic politicians of their era, both were directly approached by Soviet ambassadors with offers to help them win the presidency. And they both more or less said, I want nothing to do with this. Get the hell away from me. Because they preferred to have lost on their own national merit than to have won with the hidden assistance of foreign powers. And I don't mean to say that this is something that has no history, because in fact, many presidents in many different countries have solicited foreign interference on their behalf. Boris Yeltsin, for example, in 1996, begged Bill Clinton to help him get reelected. There's a history here. It's just that American presidential candidates have not in the past invited and welcomed foreign interference on their behalf. And I think that we need to get back to that standard, because I've been struck that so many figures in the current administration are struggling to answer that question. Is it okay to take help from foreign powers? And of course it is. It is not okay to do so, because in doing so, you're prioritizing the maintenance of the power of a regime over the continued independence and independent functioning of a democracy. And to me, I hope that when we escape our current moment, when things hopefully feel a bit less partisan, folks will be able to see that, wait, regardless of whether one side wins or loses, what matters here is that we have a process of succession that's as much up to Americans as possible, and is not up to governments that do not have the best interests of the American people at heart. And the last thing I'll say is, this matters because if a foreign leader is elected, or if a leader is elected knowing that they had the help of a foreign government, they necessarily feel psychologically indebted to that government. Their constituency becomes not just their voters, the public in itself, but also foreign powers, foreign leaders, and foreign intelligence services. And that should offend every American, because the job of their elected leaders is to serve them, not someone who sits in Beijing or Moscow. And if we let other countries interfere in our elections, that means that we can no longer count on the fact that our elected leaders' constituency will only be Americans. And when you go down that road, you get to basically the undermining and unraveling of democratic systems very quickly, as happened as early as 18th century Poland, which is when foreign countries and foreign governments started manipulating their process of succession. The leaders who were in power did what those countries wanted, not what their own people wanted. And before you knew it, Poland was invaded, annexed, and literally disappeared off the map. And I don't think that's where we are as a country in 21st century America, but the idea still holds, which is that we would rather have leaders who are not compromised and indebted to people who do not live within our own country.
Is there a danger, though, in some of this rhetoric of making the Russians out to be 10 feet tall, that there's a Russian adversary behind every corner, and that, in a sense, does the work for them and makes it easier to delegitimize political opponents? Where is that balance?
So I think that's definitely a concern. I think that's why Russia has been so willing to be caught. I think there is a certain degree of, as we've seen with the GRU inside our election systems, with the hack and release of these emails, unlike for America, I think it does serve Russia's interests to be detected, because everyone says Russia's everywhere, Russia's all powerful, Russia's sowing discord and paranoia within our democracy. And I don't buy into the argument that that should be the case for less transparency, that we should keep things from the American people as to what Russia's doing and why. I think the government should be transparent, but I think in order to prevent that sort of 10 feet tall mentality, I think with these operations, the imperative is to just follow the facts, to stick to the facts, to stick to what you know, and to describe them as such. And when we do that, when we really break down, okay, what did Russia do? They went inside our voting systems, but evidently didn't manipulate anything. They stole and released sensitive emails, and they spread propaganda across social media that reach more than 100 million Americans. Those are facts. And when you take those facts and explain them, you're not 10 feet tall, you're as tall as you are as to what you did to our electoral process. So in my opinion, the best way to get at this is just to be straightforward and to get at those facts, because almost ironically and rather sadly, I would argue that the basic thing I just said, which is the three things that Russia did in 2016, probably are still not understood by the vast majority of the public, because the media is focused much less on that and much more on, is there collusion, or, oh, look, it's Roger Stone, and chase down these rabbit holes rather than get at the hard national security issues we're confronting. And that's on us. But I don't think that that's a reason to just not talk about this or to keep things from voters, because that's how these operations can be even more effective if people don't even know that they're happening.
What should we be aware of in terms of other countries, not just Russia? Are there efforts of China that we should be concerned about?
So I'm really interested because up until 2016, the story of covert electoral interference for the last century was Russian and American interference in elections. There really was, with brief and very limited exceptions, other countries involved. This was about Moscow and Washington. But 2016 has the potential to be a turning point, because it was the first time in history that covert electoral interference was the issue, that it was outed and dramatized in such a public way, and that the world over said, wow, America was just really manipulated and humiliated so easily with so few resources by a hostile state. So therefore, the question becomes, will countries like China or North Korea or Iran see what Russia did and seek to imitate it? And when folks say that this story might be, the story of 2020 might be Chinese interference, I don't buy that, because when you restore history to this, you see that Russia is the pioneer here. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, and his advisors know these operations. They know how to apply them to pre-existing information settings in a very natural, almost instinctive way. But that doesn't mean that China, North Korea, and Iran can't follow Russia's lead and do things like steal and release documents in imitation of what Russia did 4 years ago. So to me, that is very much on the table. And I am very curious and attuned to seeing whether 2016 ends up being a turning point where this weapon goes from being a weapon of the superpowers in the Cold War to a weapon of Russia in recent years, to a weapon of all authoritarian governments to which all democracies are vulnerable. And I think that there is a credible case to be made that that is where we're headed. But time will tell as to actually seeing whether these other countries do follow Russia's lead, as they have the resources to do.
In your answer there, you mentioned all democracies, or all Western democracies, being vulnerable, and it ties into another question I'm seeing here. Based on the UK's ISC Russia report on interference and the reluctance of security professionals to announce their findings, leaving it up to the politicians to announce issues with the electoral policies or interference in the electoral process, are those structures in Western countries with law enforcement and intelligence communities deferring solely to politicians on that matter? And I, of course, want to be careful on the concepts of civil control and oversight of the security services, but also if politicians are benefiting the fox and hen house analogy, given who is guarding and who is announcing when interference is taking place.
Sure, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the UK is really a story of what not to do. because what the UK did around the Brexit referendum and thereafter was overlook the threat in real time, which to their credit, a lot of countries did. But thereafter, they didn't investigate. They didn't try to put together a detailed report on what Russia did. They didn't hunt for the facts. They basically said, we neglected this. We didn't really look into this as methodically as we should have. And then finally, you have now forced us to release a report saying so. But what's happening in the United Kingdom is rumor is now overtaking these issues. Suspicions, there are polls about whether people believe that Russia interfered in, for example, the Brexit referendum. And a democracy is losing when you're living in rumorville. You want to discover the hard information. You want to communicate that information to citizens. Then you want to figure out how to prevent governments from attacking your elections again. And so I think a lesson of the United Kingdom for all democracies is to follow the facts, to assemble the facts, not to be afraid of the truth, and then to make that truth available to voters as quickly and transparently as possible. And unless you do so, you end up playing into your adversary's hands because, again, conspiracies end up overtaking effective discourse, and there is more or less no progress to be made because now, however many years after the Brexit referendum, 4 years later, people still don't know what Russia did. And that's not helpful because even if the answer is very little, that would reassure their democracy. If the answer is that Russia did a lot, then they could take steps to defend their country moving forward. But if you live in the unknown, then you're just living in you're basically lowering your defenses and saying, you know, it's open season on our electoral processes. And I don't think that's a good place for any democracy to be.
Question here about retaliatory measures and deterrence, and their hypothetical is, could you release something about, say, details on Putin and his inner circle of oligarchs, Panama paper styles, can that stuff be released in retaliation? Should that be explored?
So I think you can. I walked through in great detail the debate inside the Situation Room in the summer and fall of 2016 in my book as to whether and when and how to hit Russia for its interference. And many options were considered. One was, a quote, was to suffocate the Russian economy. Another was to find and to release information that we possess about Putin and his inner circle, about his corruption, his activities, his associations, which is what the White House's senior Russia advisor told me she actually recommended be done prior to Election Day in order to act as a deterrent against further Russian interference in the election. So I think those options are available, as are, for example, diplomatic expulsions. But I think the predominant view, at least in the Obama era, was that getting into the mud with Putin, releasing information about him or seeking to undermine his administration is just playing into his hands, and that we're going to lose a cyber tit for tat struggle with Russia, and that where we want to be, where our comparative strength is economic, is hurting the Russian economy in alignment with our allies who are also under attack by Russia's security services. I think a credible case can be made that that's not actually so, and that there can be actions taken in the cyber domain that would really rattle the Putin regime. But I think those are questions that need to be considered. And I think that above all, the goal has to be to make the costs that are imposed on countries for doing this sort of thing higher than the perceived benefit from the perspective of the country doing it. And we're not close to there right now, because I think the punishments that were imposed on the Russians after the November 2016 election were entirely insufficient. And I think that since then, we have not established any meaningful deterrent to preventing these sorts of attacks against our elections and those of our other democracies. And until we do that with leaders like Putin, I don't know why he'd stop, because he thinks this is working and he's suffering no consequences for doing it in any real way.
Perhaps a few decades from now, if we're able to get out past the partisanship of the 2016 to 2020 window, hopefully by then, and we're looking at the history books, what will we say about the impact that Russian interference had in 2016 and its scope? Was it decisive? Did it change the outcome? How would we evaluate that?
So this is not I imagine this isn't the kind of answer that folks would want to hear, but decades sometimes don't really make a difference. So for the CIA's operations to interfere in Italy's election in 48, and Chile's election in '64. I studied those very closely, and I met with the CIA's chief internal historian. And what he told me is that 70 years later, 50 years later, we still debate how much these things mattered. We still debate whether we made the difference or not. We don't know the answers. And unless we find out that Russia actually did manipulate voting systems, which again, there's no evidence to suggest that they did, even though folks like Harry Reid believe that they did, or at least that's what he told me. If we're living in this world of influence, of propaganda, of manipulation, I think we can make credible cases. We can make analytical judgments like Kathleen Hall Jamieson has that Russia likely did swing the election. But I think there should be no illusion that 30, 40 years from now, we'll be able to say with any degree of certainty, because of Russia, X happened, because the nature of operations to manipulate people, just like the nature of political campaigns, buying ads or running, campaigns on Twitter or Facebook, you don't really know whether what you did in that regard changed a vote or changed an outcome. It's about broad common sense judgments. And I think we can say right now, in a common sense way, of course, this theft and release of the DNC and Podesta emails, and of course, Russian propaganda of social media, across social media had an impact. Whether that impact was decisive or determinative, I don't know, and I don't expect that 20 years from now on now.
Given the U.S. system and the federal structure of the electoral system and so much given to states and local governments, what do you think are ways we can obviously strengthen and better secure the elections, but perhaps also build on the strengths of federalism, because it is not a centralized electoral facility. So it has benefits and drawbacks. Does that fit into a better way to secure our elections?
So to me, the bare minimum is that we secure our election systems. If we're in a place like we were in '16, where the GRU is inside our election systems and folks like John Brennan and Jim Clapper are bracing for Russia to alter the vote tallies of American citizens, then we will be playing from a position of weakness and desperation in every election that we hold from now until we resolve that issue. We need to secure our election systems, whether that means by passing mandatory cybersecurity standards for states where they can still administer their elections, they can still control their election systems, but basically saying, you can't have an unencrypted voter registration database, because where we're at right now is, if states don't want to accept federal help, if states want to do nothing to secure their election systems, that's up to them. And that is irreflective of how the world has changed, because in 1960, Russia did not have the capability to penetrate and manipulate our ballot boxes. Now the GRU does, because of the internet, and therefore our government and the structure of our government must evolve. I think that a strength of our election system is the federalist structure of it. I think it's a good thing that states can make their own election administrations unique, because that makes it so we're not vulnerable to one nationwide hack, and that's fine. Our diversity is an asset. However, it's only an asset if every state is a responsible actor in seeking to secure their systems. We're only as strong as our weakest system. And in that regard, I think the Congress can do much more in terms of both passing more money for election security, but also having security requirements for states that would make it so that our systems aren't just open for manipulation. I think we've made a lot of progress there since 2016, but I'm very skeptical that we are in a position now where our systems are immune to penetration, scanning, probing, and therefore manipulation as they were 4 years ago. And the bigger problem here, the much more difficult to resolve problem, is that second bucket: how to stop foreign actors from manipulating minds, from spreading propaganda in our information environment. And before we even address that, or in order to address that, we need to get our own house in order in terms of securing our voting systems, because, as I already mentioned, it was that fusion of two types of interference. It was that Russia could both be inside our systems and spread so much propaganda 4 years ago that made this such a difficult problem to resolve. And we can really take away a lot of the tactical agency of Russia by just securing our voting systems, which should not be that hard to do. We're a very sophisticated country. It should not be so difficult to make it so that Russian military intelligence can make it so that my voter registration information is scrambled and cause chaos at polling places on election day. That should not be a credible concern moving forward. And I think that our lawmakers and our leaders need to take the necessary action to make sure that our systems are secure from that kind of subversion.
do you think the Twitters and Facebooks of the world should be held more accountable for election misinformation or interference?
Yeah, I mean, I think that social media companies, like, in fairness, journalists, like the US government, they were all caught off guard in 2016. But I think that moving forward, there are just common sense things that these companies should be doing to protect our elections. I think that they're making progress in some regards, like public-private cooperation. I think you've seen members of companies like Facebook work with the federal government to identify and take down foreign networks across their platform. I think it's on social media companies to be as transparent as possible, not to cover up when they identify these networks, but to let the public know that these networks exist. Because, someone asked how to make the Russians seem 10 feet tall. If Facebook says, we found this network of Russian accounts and we took it down, Russia doesn't seem 10 feet tall. What makes Russia seem big is if Facebook tries to cover it up, it's then leaked to the Washington Post, and there's a big Washington Post story about Facebook's cover up of this huge Russian network. So I think that if these companies are transparent, they both lead to more rational discussion and they prevent voters from being uninformed. And then finally, I absolutely believe that the Congress should be figuring out ways to oversee and regulate social media companies. I think it's a real abdication of responsibility of our elected government that they have not taken any legislative steps regarding social media companies since 2016. And on the one hand, I do expect social media companies, or I would hope they would be more transparent and they'd cooperate with the government, but I don't want to let the government off the hook here because this is about our democratic sovereignty. It is the responsibility of our elected officials to guard that, to defend our country. And part of that is to oversee and regulate social media companies, as we learned 4 years ago, and our government has not done that. So I think that social media companies have a role to play here. I think it's a cop-out for the government to say, therefore, we have nothing to do here because Facebook can just figure it out. I think that is an extraordinary relinquishment of the responsibility of our legislative process. And I think that there are two things that need to happen at once. One is for these companies to take more responsibility, but the other is for our lawmakers to say that we're also going to take some responsibility and regulate these companies as we do other news sources.
Seeing where we're at with the time, I have a final question here, and I think it also can flow into any concluding remarks you might have before Glenn wraps us up. But what we're seeing in terms of new technologies, AI, deepfakes, how do you think that will change both interfering in elections and defending them?
So I do think there's a bit of perhaps leaning too much into the idea that deepfakes will change everything. I don't think that's true, but I do think that there's a broader lesson here, which is, again, that these operations are always evolving. When you only view 2016 as a one-off in history, then the presumption would naturally be, okay, then Russia in the future will just manipulate social media platforms and hack and release emails. But when you restore history and you see that Russia's operations to manipulate voters abroad have been evolving for a century, have constantly been adapting to the new opportunities of the moment, that clarifies that in 2024, 8, these operations will look different. Maybe it'll be deepfakes and whatnot, or maybe it will be the theft and release of someone's medical records, or maybe it will be that thing that we just haven't thought of yet that will most likely take advantage of our own divisions, our own vulnerabilities, and our own pre-existing fissures, because that's the tradition of Russian intelligence in this space. But I think that we can't be complacent in saying, so long as we're bracing for email dumps and we're bracing for the Internet Research Agency's work, therefore we've secured our elections, because while we're fighting the last war here, Russia's getting ready to attack our newfound vulnerabilities. For example, thinking about 4 years ago versus today, 4 years ago, we were vulnerable to propaganda. Today, our voting process, because of the coronavirus, because of allegations that this election will be rigged from the sitting president, there's immense doubt about the security, safety, and legitimacy of the vote itself. So if I'm a foreign adversary, I would see much more benefit to, say, causing chaos at polling places, or seeking to manipulate voter databases, or seeking to spread false information about the election outcome on social media after the vote takes place to confuse voters. That to me is a vulnerability of ours that is much more significant now than it was in, let's say, 2012, when I don't think there was much concern at all among the public that we were going to be able to have a secure and stable election. So I think when we think about what's coming, we need to challenge ourselves to place our minds in those of our adversaries and see our country for what it is, and how vulnerable we are and where. And right now, I think by far our greatest vulnerability is a broad concern and worry that we're not even going to be able to have a legitimate election in November.
Well, David, let me just conclude by thanking you very much for appearing with us today, for the work you put into this book. It is tremendously valuable in terms of clarifying some of the aspects that we need to understand in order to prepare ourselves to understand the historical nature of what's happening, to grapple with the current challenge. You have, I think, quite aptly described a sense of resilience that we ought to seek to achieve in this country. I'm afraid that we are far from that we are not only not prepared to flexibly adapt to the challenges that are coming that we don't know yet. I'm afraid we haven't quite internalized the lessons of 2016 to prepare to combat the known challenges, the known tactics that we have already seen and that we should be able to anticipate and counter, with the exception of the fact that public awareness of the issue is much higher than it was 4 years ago. We have a lot of work to do, and I really appreciate you taking the effort to put together this very helpful book, Rigged: America, Russia, and 100 Years of Covert Electoral Influence, and for spending the time with us, David, to think through what we can do better. So thank you so much for the effort. Thank you to all of our participants for joining and asking great questions. David, you handled them very well, and I just want to again say we appreciate you being with us and helping enlighten us on this very valuable topic.
You know, it's my honor and pleasure to be here. So thank you very much for having me.
Great. And thanks everybody for being with us. Everybody be well and take care.
Thanks.
See you
Bye.
soon.